Welcome to AIDS 2060, a project of A Shot in the Arm Media, where we look at the long-term trends affecting the global HIV response, which will, regardless of what our leaders and our masters and mistresses tell us, will be and will remain one of the major challenges facing global society throughout this century. In this episode, we explore how the climate crisis is affecting HIV. And I feel very deeply, unlike a number of colleagues and peers in the global health field, that the climate crisis is the great disruptor, that it will cause disruption to population changes and population movements, fire, flooding, economic changes that will be bad and good, because, of course, HIV flourishes in both environments. And I think this is all going to deeply affect the natural history of HIV and our efforts to contain it. All the external pressures that foment HIV infection are coming together. And don't forget, HIV is like Ebola in slow motion. It infects, but it can take years, not days, to manifest. And there is no cure. Well, to help out and tease through these and other issues, I am delighted to be joined by friend of the pod, diplomat, author, and podcaster, but above all, a unique strategic thinker who connects issues in ways that others really haven't considered. Also by happen chance, he's launching the US edition of Elemental, the new geography of climate change and how we survive it, today in the United States as we record. Arthur Snell, welcome back to the podcast. I say welcome back. This is AIDS 2060. It's different. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be back with talking to you, Ben. After a little while, we were just reflecting. So thank you for having me back.
Well, it's really great that you're here to help us think through some of the challenges affecting HIV the HIV response in the coming few decades. First up, though, could you remind our listeners and viewers, as well as those that are new subscribers, about your background and how that has helped you, enabled you to sharpen your ability to see the connection between trends?
Oh, well, thank you. I started out as a history major at Oxford University a very long time ago in the 90s, and I then joined the British Diplomatic Service, Foreign Office as we call it, State Department for US listeners. And again, the late 90s was a very different world. Of course, the Cold War had ended, but 9/11 had not happened. And to be honest with you, historians of the modern era sometimes talk about the happy 90s, a period of relative stability. Of course, there were still crises, as there always are in the world arena, but a period of relative stability, relatively low numbers of conflicts around the world. That was a picture that changed rapidly, and certainly my career was profoundly affected by the events of 9/11. I ended up working to some extent on the front lines of those, the aftermath, so places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and then that work also took me through headquarters roles in London, looking at radicalization, looking at counterterrorism. And then finally, I was a head of mission, a high commissioner, as we Brits insist on calling them, an ambassador in normal words, in the Caribbean. So I had a very varied career. And I think the variations is perhaps the answer to your question. Why that helps me, having served in several continents in both sort of classic diplomacy, going to ministries, lobbying officials, but also for example, in a military base, at a forward operating base in Helmand province in Afghanistan with US Marine Corps as colleagues. So it's that variety which I think has helped me in the work I do now, where I write, I consult on geopolitical affairs, and I just try to make sense of this crazy world that we're all inhabiting. Which is, shall we say, a daily struggle.
That is certainly true. And as we were waiting for the podcast to begin, we were just sort of nattering about how the world has turned itself on its head since we last spoke. I honestly feel quite pessimistic about our ability to navigate through things. And I think you mentioned before that as it relates to the United Kingdom, much of this is driven by Brexit. In terms of the United States, clearly we have the MAGA movement. But it's not just there. It's Argentina, it's now Colombia. And of course, we're seeing it in a number of African countries that are just thrilled that the transactional approach that Trump has taken to overseas development and overseas aid allows them more flexibility rather than accountability and transparency in the delivery of particularly health services. But in Elemental, you show how we could, in your words, survive it, if not being able to thrive in an era of the climate crisis. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you've picked up on that, because it was, in a way, one of the key messages of the book for me. It's a book about the geopolitics of the climate crisis, about how it affects world power relations, how it affects, the relationships between states, how it affects conflict and economic questions and those sorts of things, rather than what we might consider a classic kind of ecological examination. But in the book, I talk about survival because it seems to me that one of the challenges about the climate crisis is that a lot of people, very understandably, look at the shifts. I mean, just as we're recording this, we're having record-breaking temperatures here across Europe, including in the UK, where I am. And these are really dangerous temperatures that will cause some people to die. This is no longer just a nice sunny day. And of course, weather is not climate, but these extreme weather events are happening more and more often. The impact on wider ecosystems, on agricultural yields, on all kinds of elements is easy to see. But that doesn't mean that humanity has only got a couple of decades to run. The fact is that most of us will still be here. And in a way, that was a key point for me in writing this book. That is not to say it's okay. It's not to say that we can be complacent about it. Far from it. But we do have to accept that a lot of us will be in this world. And so we have to think about what this world is going to be like, whether at that macro level of relations between superpowers or at a more micro level of how people live in towns and communities, how they power their homes, how they transport themselves, and all the rest of it.
No, I find that fascinating. I think in the early days of the HIV response, we were having very similar thoughts about how HIV might impact all sorts of areas of economic and social life, from population movement, come back to that in a minute, but, economic growth. It's no surprise, for example, that the Chinese were very insistent in the early 2000s about very active and visible HIV, primarily testing programs, but there were care support and prevention attached to it in some places. But they were very aware of what the impact could be should the active adult community, which are most at risk of HIV, did indeed become infected. Talking about populations, we sort of sense that there is going to be significant disruption caused by the climate crisis. The erosion of natural resources in countries on either side of the Sahara Desert, perhaps even a sort of a breaking down of national boundaries of these countries, again, particularly in the Sahel, but potentially even in the Mediterranean, north of the Mediterranean as well. And so what is your sense of how equipped we are to be able to deal with what are going to be massive population movements? And again, those are presumably going to be from the Sahara going north and indeed south to the sort of slightly richer southern African countries. But what's your sense of how this might play out, and are we prepared for it?
Yeah, I think, the basic answer, are we prepared for it? No. And a lot of the reasons for that is because countries around the world obviously the United States is a good example, but actually countries with quite a wide variety of political movements that run them are taking a hard line, or increasingly hard line, on migration. So whether you're at the sort of MAGA approach, or you're actually talking about European Union, which is largely a fairly liberal institution, there's still, when it comes to migration, an increasingly hard line. But I think what's interesting about this story for me is that it is now global. And I think that's an important point I want to emphasize. So in the past, we have managed to, in the rhetoric at least, we've managed to isolate migration. So we'll say there's a crisis in Central America, or there's a crisis in Turkey, or whatever, or, the events of the civil war in Syria. So there's a Syrian migration crisis. But what the climate crisis does is turns this into a global phenomenon. So clearly, the United States faces the challenges of people being pushed off the lands in places like Guatemala. As you know, in my book, I speak to people working in the aid sector there. In Europe, we're looking at the complete breakdown of entire countries in the Sahel region. They simply are ceasing to function as nation states. And this is not solely due to the climate crisis. Important point. I don't want listeners to think that I have sort of fixated on this, but the climate crisis acts as a catalyst. So it makes existing problems more severe, more intense, just as a catalyst in a chemical scenario does, as we all know from our high school science. But actually in Asia as well, whether we're talking about South Asia, even China. China may lead the way in the technical response in terms of the energy transition. Perhaps we'll talk about that a bit. But it is by no means insulated from the weather effects. There are parts of China that will become very hard to live in with extreme humidity and heat. And many Chinese living in the North Chinese Plain are considering moving into the far east of Russia, a part of Russia, which of course China lays claim to under some historic land disputes dating to the 19th century. So I think what this shows us is that we can no longer try to isolate migration as a question that exists for maybe one or two countries or one or two particular geographies, that it's going to become a global phenomenon. And actually, for what we might call the global north, rich Western countries, all of which have falling populations, aging populations, all kinds of challenges with demography and labor force. I think we're not there yet, but the first politician in this space to come up with a realistic and pragmatic approach to migration may be the one that benefits.
Well, in a sense, let's hope so. Although I think it's too late for us to do anything about the population displacement that's going to come.
Yeah.
That your clear assertion that this is something broader than just Africa, I think is very important for the global health field. We think about population displacement in the context of Africa, particularly Central African states in particular.
Yeah.
But it's going to be something that is going to be much more widespread. And, you can picture whole parts of Spain, for example, being uninhabitable during summer months.
Yeah. And arguably, we're there already. Right now in France and Spain, temperatures are in the 40s Celsius. So American listeners will do their sums but that's over 100, okay? And these are environments where, until recently, housing was not routinely installed with air conditioning, because these are not normal occurrences. And you've got, of course, a lot of people live in old houses that are not easily re-engineered for these kinds of extreme weather situations. So, the depopulation may not be unique to what we call the global South. And I think this is actually something that's relevant to the United States as well, because what's interesting to me is that when I was looking at this story from the perspective of the US, some of the fastest growing places in the US population-wise, are some of the places that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. So it's not just extreme heat. We've touched on that, but extreme weather events, hurricanes, super hurricanes, flooding, rising sea levels. With places like Florida, coastal parts of Texas, these are all places that are not well situated to deal with this scenario. But ironically, these are places that are currently relatively fast growing if you look at the fastest growing cities in America. Whereas the places that have been depopulated, places like Cleveland, Ohio, arguably geographically speaking, the best suited to a warming world, both the latitude, but actually being next to large bodies of fresh water. These are all things that help moderate the temperature. So there is this strange irony, which, maybe we'll see a reversal of some of these trends, that people will think, does it make sense to live at 0 meters above sea level in Florida with a rising sea? We're already seeing some domestic properties becoming uninsurable in the United States for climate reasons, not for other reasons.
And it is interesting, isn't it, that those two states in the US that you referred to, Texas and Florida, have state politics at the moment where a skepticism, at the very least, of the climate crisis is driving state policy. And it, my friend Emily will kill me for revealing this. I've started reading Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam again for like the 100th time. But there was one thing after reading Elemental that struck me, and that part of her narrative in this, in terms of a world being dramatically changed by climate in this particular set of dystopian novels. But part of the effect is that, Texas, Florida, other parts of the South become utterly uninhabitable, and you have mass populations of Americans trying to move north.
Yeah.
And the residents of those states that people are moving into being hostile to that. But it's not all doom and gloom for Africa. This is the other thing I found so fascinating in Elemental. And you raise the potential of the continent. I take it from this: you are a Pan-African, and you see Africa emerging as an energy superpower. Or if one was sort of perhaps more in favor of African nationalism, you would see a few countries really excelling at this. But I do think it's a continent-wide opportunity. I'm also seeing the dramatic growth of the entertainment industry, particularly across Nigeria, South Africa, and to some degree Kenya and Rwanda. But what does the future could be bright for Africa? What could that look like?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way to answer this really is actually a question of resources. And of course, some of the darker bits of Africa's history are about the foreigners exploiting African resources, colonialism, slavery, and so on. We know these stories. But of course, if African states, whether on a national basis or transnational basis, are able to take ownership of the resources and benefit, clearly that offers a great future. Now, some of these resources are physical resources, so lithium, other critical minerals. Sadly, I think at this stage, a lot of that, the way that is being extracted is along a fairly sort of tried and trusted model of largely foreign interests, largely exploiting. And of course, there are rewards to local populations, but there's also a lot of downsides. It can feed corruption. These mine sites can be very dangerous for people to work in. But we shouldn't then say that it's all bad. That there is a clear point here that the critical minerals necessary for the energy transition, they're found all over the world, but they're found in great concentration on the African continent. So that is one point to note. But I think in a way, perhaps more interestingly, are two other assets that Africa has. One is a lot of prime agricultural land. Now, of course, Africa in its history again has sometimes struggled to feed itself. But again, this is if you take a whole continent view. But of course, there are individual sort of centers of excellence, and there's a lot of very impressive things happening. Now, one of the wars that is currently raging on the African continent, the war in Sudan, is effectively being fought by two proxies, United Arab Emirates on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other, over control of fertile and mineral-rich land in Sudan, which of course is a vast country, one of the largest in Africa. So at the moment, this is manifesting in a negative way, but you can see the potential there for the future. But I think the final and the most important bit of this is renewable energy itself. And this is where it gets interesting, because obviously, historically, one of the advantages that hydrocarbon energy, fossil fuel energy had was that it's a unit that you can transport, whether it's barrels of oil or liquefied natural gas. And the model of hydrocarbon energy is it's extracted in one place and then enters a global market and is exported over long distances in many cases. We tend to think of electricity as something you can't export. You know, the physics of power cables is such that you lose the power if you take it too far. Now, that science is changing radically. So already in China, you have long distance, high capacity power transmission where you lose almost none of the energy. So you might have a dam or onshore wind installation in one place, and it could be powering a city a few hundred miles away. Now, when we start to think particularly of North Africa and its proximity to Europe, to Mediterranean Europe, we start to see the potentiality here. And one of the great potential benefits of a transition to a renewable energy world is effectively creating a kind of globalized electricity grid. And we're already seeing evidence of this happening. So one of the things about renewable energy is, of course, you have to balance supply and demand. You might have a very sunny day in one place and, a cloudy day somewhere else, and that affects, the amount of electricity that you can generate. Obviously, at the moment, we've got very, very hot weather in Europe, a lot of people using air conditioners and things like that. So that's creating a surge of demand. So we're already seeing these cross-border interconnectors. Basically, these are cables that run under the sea or across national boundaries. And more and more of those are proposed. And so you get to the point where we're not saying, well, what's the installed grid production for Spain or Britain or France? We're saying, what is the installed grid production for a huge number of countries that are using increasingly sophisticated technologies, including AI, to balance out supply and demand? And interestingly, just talking about North Africa, one project that's been under consideration, which is technologically completely feasible. There are questions around the economics and the regulatory hurdles, but technologically, you can install solar and wind energy in Morocco and use it to power homes in Britain. So if you just think about the distance from North Africa all the way to Britain in Northern Europe, and that is, you could do that, in tomorrow in terms of the technology needed.
I mean, very interesting. And from the HIV perspective, this will, if it's organized correctly, will allow African countries themselves to own more, hopefully all of the network that is produced and created and rooted in their countries. So income comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point that you're looking at, and what I think makes this a bit different, because there are obviously case studies where hydrocarbon energy has not benefited the population of a country. And of course, Nigeria is a classic example, although I think that may be very slightly shifting now, but historically, it's hard to see much benefit to the average Nigerian of the billions of dollars of oil wealth. I think it's a bit different with electricity generation because it requires much more integration between the seller and the buyer. It's not a barrel of oil that is traded on an international spot market. We're talking long-term relationships. And then that tends to bind countries more closely together. It tends to give more opportunity for ensuring that this wealth is spread more equitably. So whilst I'm not going to say it's a panacea, that it solves all the problems, but I think it offers quite a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think, moving on from being a continent where the economy is driven by things that are taken out of the continent to a continent that is generating energy, wealth, and hopefully that's translating into prosperity. I mean, of course, it comes from the HIV perspective with risks because you're likely to have large numbers of employees working to create this. Let's face it, a large number of those will be men who are away from their homes. And as we saw in the early days of the epidemic in Southern Africa's mines, particularly in Zambia, as well as South Africa, this was an opportunity for HIV to spread very effectively in, remote workplace environments. And then, of course, you have the issue of risk of HIV infection when young people move to large urban areas and are, I'm not saying a MAGA pro-family thing here, Arthur, but I am saying that, rooting yourself in the norms of your local community give you a sense of perspective that perhaps being in a large urban setting with no friends, no context, makes, your interests and your demands much more, excuse the pun, elemental.
Yeah. No, I'm sure it must increase risk factors ultimately. And I suppose what we're doing here is talking about agglomerated macro factors that result in meaningful differences in the overall infection rates, I guess.
And then, I'm able to, go back and remind our dear colleagues in the State Department that, in fact, private sector workplace awareness testing and, prevention and treatment programs are actually very sensible things to do. And we have all the data and evidence to support that from the 90s and the 2000s, which, of course, may not affect the decision makers. There was one other issue I wanted to look at the 38,000 foot level, and that's the rise of populism. And, in the HIV and the global health field, we know it so well through the rise of mis and disinformation from, particularly from the internet around health issues, health scares. Of course, for HIV, that's nothing new. We had the AIDS denialism of Berkeley, UC Berkeley, transform underground movements around the world. And in fact, in the case of South Africa under Thabo Mbeki's leadership, actually putting that denial into policy. And you see such a rapid increase of infections during that era. But how, in this environment of disruption, you talked about hopefully a liberal democratic leader finding a way of developing a compelling message for the public around how to deal with mass global population movement. But is there not a risk that all of these challenges that we'll be facing, caused in large part by the climate crisis, speak exactly in the short term to a populist close the doors, let's stick to our own values? We've always been, able to avoid 102, 106 temperatures in our cities. How do you feel that the populist movement itself is going to affect and be affected by climate change?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fascinating kind of codependency, if you like. There's an interesting dynamic there. So climate denial, well, certainly extreme climate skepticism and denial, which I think we talk about the MAGA movement. It's more, I would say, it's more denial than skepticism. That and populism, there's a big overlap. So, of course, not all populists are climate deniers, but almost all of them are. And what you see then is the way they do that responds to the norms of their society. So, United States, unfortunately, I think is one of the few countries where a kind of full denial of the climate crisis is still a tenable position by a mainstream politician. I mean, you've got Donald Trump himself talking about the scam of the century. In other places where, for whatever reason, people have accepted the reality of it and accepted that it's man-made, then you might have a different approach. So the approach we see in the UK, a lot of the hostility is pushed towards the response. So the adaptation and mitigation, the UK government objective to reach net zero is constantly, and this is disinformation, is constantly portrayed as something that will bankrupt the country. There have been numerous economic studies that will show that it basically pays for itself, because what you're doing is re-engineering your infrastructure, which all countries need to do. And Britain, as you know, Ben, needs to do it sooner rather than later, because a lot of our infrastructure's falling apart anyway. So this is not some sort of economic disaster, and clearly you're driving new technologies, it's investment, it's innovation, it's all these things that most people think of as wholly positive as economic activities. But so there is this populist overlap there. But I think the other point is to go a bit deeper. Is, of course, ironically, of course, the more the populist preaches denial, that particularly if it's in environments where the country is systemically significant. So the US obviously is a huge industrial power. A country like Brazil with the Amazon basin, there are countries that can literally budge the needle, but through the actions of its leaders and its sort of political choices. And so, there is this weird irony that the populists denying that the crisis is occurring are, of course, making sure that the crisis will occur even quicker than previously. But I think finally, what's interesting about it, because a lot of people say, well, okay, but at a certain point, climate denialism becomes impossible. When you've seen the super hurricane, when you've seen the flash flooding, when you've seen the unprecedentedly high temperatures. But I think, interestingly, populists, and this is why it is such a in a very cynical way, such a successful political movement, populists always have an answer. So when there were terrible floods, I think it was in Alabama, in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election, you had the spectacle of both Trump and his sort of outliers saying, the corrupt Democrats have taken all the aid money, all the FEMA money, and they've given it to Ukraine. That's not true, but it's a sort of an easy hit. And in fact, there's quite a lot of case studies. There's a case study from Spain where recognition of climate change is very high in the population. So climate denialism is a very small phenomenon. But when there were terrible flash floods in Valencia in Spain, the response of the right-wing populists there was to attack the government's response. So again, the equivalent of FEMA was accused of having not done enough, and it plays into this idea that the public sector is inefficient and corrupt and full of people who don't do their jobs properly and so on. So you have this situation where something that you think ought to undermine a populist position, because it seems like pure evidence of this crisis, is actually used to bolster their position. Because what populism is mostly about is not facts, it's about fear. And so, of course, extreme weather events are fearful events. And so ultimately, I think that there's a way in which we think we can defeat populism with logic and say, well, look at these more and more extreme events. Surely this disproves your analysis. And actually, populists, they're not worried about logic. They see it as an opportunity to weaponize fear all the more.
Do you see, this is a classic example where I think the HIV movement can really learn from the description you've provided. Again, so easily would it have been us to slot in HIV and replace
with all those descriptions
in your analysis. Yeah, and we're seeing it in the United States. We're seeing the really shocking and sudden termination of funds for hard-hit minorities facing HIV infection. You may recall I'm the chair of a local community health center in San Francisco that thankfully its funding has not been immediately dramatically affected because it played a leading role in some of the litigation conducted by Lambda Legal to, prevent Trump from implementing some of these in this case, trans population investments. Yeah. But it all comes back to trying to provide some memory of a past that never existed, but, where, young girls would just cross their legs and say no, and husbands would only ever think of sex when it came to reproduction and walking into the household after a busy day at the office. So I think it's really important for our movement to take these threats of populism really seriously. We're still trying to imagine that we're living in a self-contained world where it's so obvious that HIV needs to be tackled that we don't really need to make the arguments anymore. And that's all gone.
I couldn't agree more. And obviously, I've got no expertise on the HIV response, although for what it's worth, the Thabo Mbeki era was an era that I worked as a diplomat in Zimbabwe. And of course, South Africa has a lot of influence on Zimbabwe. And so we saw a lot of that seeping over. And some of the themes of his kind of denialism, which he very cynically and clearly incorrectly vested in a kind of Africa versus the West narrative, played very well into the Robert Mugabe's narrative, which, of course, again, oppressing his own people whilst claiming that he was doing this as a kind of African liberation action. But yeah, this I think a major challenge of the kind of technocratic, liberal, educated class has been the belief that we succeed by making logical and carefully delivered arguments. And clearly, we started at the beginning talking about Brexit. As it happens, the day of recording is the 10th anniversary, a miserable anniversary, I'm afraid, of the original terrible referendum. We all know the outcome. And that was a classic case study. Maybe it will become the emblematic case study of one campaign that had marshaled a whole series of very, very high-quality arguments, but also high-quality messengers, including President Obama, who we all remember came over, gave a speech. You had Nobel Prize-winning economists, you had scientists, you had all the smart people. And on the other side, you had a literally and almost proudly mendacious campaign making crazy claims that, vote for this and, we'll add hundreds of millions of pounds of funding to the National Health Service or all kinds of nonsensical claims. But we know which side won. And obviously the response is not mendacity, but the response is certainly to be better at appealing to, I think, emotional and cultural things, attaching importance to emotional and cultural factors, because it seems to me that that's where the sort of technocratic educated elite, which I am definitely part of, we have lost the ability to win these arguments. And of course, that our Brexit was your Trump. I mean, I'm not, that's an unsophisticated point, but in terms of that type of campaign and where it failed, I think we've seen that with both of Trump's election victories.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. One of the other things you raised in the book, which again is important for the global health movement because it needs to forge relationships with the non-communicable disease movement, is around the impact of NCDs, non-communicable diseases caused by wildfires. And you talk about asthma, and particularly that directly on people close to the fires, particularly the firefighters. And then you also talk about the mental health of firefighters themselves, having to deal with this such in-your-face disruption and collapse of entire communities. I wondered if you could say more about that. And I know we're not anywhere prepared to address these challenges, but do you see any hopeful routes of change emerging?
Yeah, well, certainly wildfires, particularly if I'm talking to a North American audience, you guys have more knowledge and experience of this than I do. Mercifully, in the UK, we haven't really experienced that. But clearly, California, Idaho, all across the West, we see these immense wildfires. And from interviews that I did, talking to firefighters and research and so on, it's very clear that there is a real limit on what can be done. We're talking here, obviously, America is the most powerful, most technologically advanced country on earth by some margin, and yet actually there isn't a solution to this. But it will get worse because of the shifting climate. Now, there are elements, forest management, and it appears that an understandable attempt to limit all fires in forests has actually been a mistaken idea, because what happens is then the combustible material builds up and then it just burns in a massive quantity, whereas in the sort of historic and even sort of pre-Columbian America, if you like, that was an approach that was taken by Native Americans, which was probably more effective. But of course, they weren't grappling with a shifting climate at the same time. But I think, there's a couple of things I'd note from this, that yes, there are lots of negative impacts and yes, non-communicable diseases, because I think we tend to think mostly about destruction, physical destruction of the built environment, houses and so on. And obviously the big fire in Los Angeles, the Palisades fire, that's one that has stuck in lots of people's memories, probably because some famous people's houses were burned. But there are, yes, the respiratory challenges, all kinds of other elements. And of course, another thing about wildfires is that they are now significant in their own CO2 contribution to the overall global warming. So, of course, global warming was a man-made phenomenon caused almost entirely by fossil fuels that we burned in order to do things. And that's still the case, but actually wildfires are becoming a significant element of that. And of course, that isn't caused directly by man, although clearly there's the indirect link. But one thing I would say is that actually wildfires are a good example of something that tends to bring countries together. I think, to borrow from the title of my own book, Elemental, I think some of these really elemental challenges, a bit like a tsunami or an earthquake, it tends to cause even countries that are at loggerheads to try to collaborate. It doesn't always work, but actually, let's just think about the fires in Los Angeles last year, where there was an amazing response. Countries from all over the world sent firefighters, sent special equipment, sent aid. Even Ukraine that you would think they've got enough fires of their own to put out, but they did that. Now, of course, geopolitics is never absent. This was in a period when the second Trump presidency had just begun. Ukraine was trying to establish its credentials and so on. Interestingly, China sent no help at all. Now, I'm not saying that to single out China as good or bad, but it gives you a sense of how the geopolitics of these things can be quite intricate. But I think in broad terms, and certainly we see it in Europe, wildfires have a positive effect of drawing countries together. And that is something where there are still, it's very easy to talk about the kind of end of the multilateral system. And it's under enormous strain. And in some elements, it has failed. But I think there are still certain topics, certain areas of activity where multilateralism gets a boost. And I think wildfires is one of them.
Another area where multilateralism should and could get a boost is over the whole One Health agenda, pandemics preparation. And you'll probably be aware that this is not something post-COVID that has gone particularly well. Either the investment fund in the World Bank or the treaty that was going to be signed by all countries under the auspices of WHO. Yeah. So it's not worked, our preparation for it. But as climate affects, and you talk about the tundra in Siberia particularly, Canada could also be considered, and you again refer to the fact that we might lose the Arctic ice by a frighteningly close date. Is it 2050 or 2030?
In the decade of the 2030s, we'll see that ice cap break up, most likely. So obviously, 2026 now, that really isn't long away.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I'm not Stephen King by any means, but the risk of pathogens that we haven't experienced before, that have emerged in earlier stages of a warmer climate. I mean, there's a real risk of these being released into the environment. And I said, we've in the global health community not really had the impact that we wanted to have. But what about more broadly the folks that you might interact with, the long-term strategists and policy influencers? What could we do there to try and raise more awareness of, the pandemic risk of climate?
I think it's a very crisis. Good case study, because there are all kinds of ways in which this could occur. One, as you've described there, is literally as retreating ice exposes pathogens that have been not been hitherto seen. The other one is, of course, displaced populations, the something jumping from animals to humans, because either the climate has displaced a population or the climate has displaced a food source, which leads people to move to a new food source, which they think is safe, and it turns out it isn't. So this is definitely something that people, I think, in the kind of, the sort of strategic thinkers in the national security space are aware of. And to be fair, even when I think we can and we should criticize the response to COVID in certain respects, and of course different countries had different responses. But certainly there was a strong awareness in the health security community of the risks of some kind of novel virus, spreading. So certainly the climate crisis increases those risks. And ultimately, I think that what we see with the climate crisis, as I say, it acts as this kind of catalyst, so that the risk is already there, but it makes it more intense. It makes the possible effects more dramatic. What can we learn from this? What can global health community learn from it? I think there is this challenge again about consent and trust, and clearly we talked about mis and disinformation, and COVID is almost ground zero for a lot of this stuff. That a lot of people who were, for example, very content to get vaccinations pre-COVID are now anti-vaxxers. How did that happen? That to me is a bizarre shift, but to those people it makes perfect sense. And in a way, I think finding ways to communicate with those people and resisting what I think is a perfectly reasonable urge. Those of us who are still believing in science and getting our vaccinations, and in the general space of health being a science-based activity, we get intensely frustrated, don't we? And we just say, well, these stupid people, what are they doing? But of course, that doesn't increase vaccine uptake, that kind of response. So we've got to find better ways of communicating.
I'm beginning to see shoots of optimism happening around things like the Global Listening Project and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, considering this, the idea that it is actually a question of trust, as you pointed out, and that we in the global health community have got to do a better job of building trust, rather than expecting people to believe, and this goes counter to much of the populists' worldview, that we don't go back to a sort of a patriarchal, listen to what the doctor says and be terrified of matron and the nurse. So we're at the top of the hour. As we think about briefing HIV policymakers in the next 20 or 30 years, and as they take stock of the environment externally around them, if we were to put this in a time capsule on a USB stick of some kind, and they come to look at it, not that they perhaps would have other things that were more priority, but what would you advise them to do? What have we missed in this sort of fairly broad conversation about the trends that we have to face?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one area to think about is this point about global mobility. Now, of course, that's very well understood in the health context, and it's very much something that is at the heart of a lot of understanding about the spread of pandemics and so on. But I just wonder whether we've done enough to think about the impact of the climate on that. So we're not just talking about sort of normal aviation traffic in a given month or year or whatever. We're talking about really dramatic population shifts and the impacts that those have. I think another thing is, again, and I do this in the book, I'm a great believer in trying to learn from history, possibly because that's my own background, that there are periods in history where climate shifts have occurred which have led to dramatic changes on the ground. And some of those include health changes. So, for example, an area we haven't talked very much about, but I think is worth exploring, is this point about food and the impact on the global food system of the changing climate. I mean, I touched there, obviously, pandemics might arise from changed behaviors, but actually the question of malnutrition, which of course makes people more susceptible, it weakens immune systems and all the rest of it. So I think doing some projecting about food, about mobility, and those sorts of things, I think that would be something I would encourage. I'm sure it's happening already, but it feels to me an important point to make.
Yeah, and food security needs absolutely to be one of the issues that we as a community take on. It's interesting that the World Food Programme is part of the co-sponsors of UNAIDS, this sort of joint program of UN agencies. I mean, the UN is getting a bit of battering at the moment, of course, but to put it mildly, but we have the ability to start the conversation there. And it's, as you say, people's health, immune systems become, less strong as they become malnourished. And that is obviously of particular concern to newborns if, they haven't been able to have the prevention of mother-to-child transmission intervention, and they themselves are born with HIV. That's really helpful, Arthur. Thank you. Well, I guess that is it for this episode. There are many more questions I had for you, but I think this hour has been really interesting, and I think it'll provide a lot of food for thought to folks in the global HIV and the broader global health movement as they start thinking what their plans need to be after 2030, which, by the way, is the date that the UN General Assembly decided back in 2016 that the AIDS epidemic would be over as a public health crisis. And it's just so wonderful to see viruses respecting international declarations. Anyway, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you are not too bedraggled by the heat.
It's not as hot as London here, but it's still pretty damn hot. But it's been great talking to you and actually to think about some of these bigger issues. So thank you for having me.
Real pleasure. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you to Arthur Snell. Remember, you can find Elemental wherever you find your books. Preferably in small booksellers, but that's another matter altogether. Thank you to Eric Aspera, our director and producer from A Shot in the Arm Media, and a big thanks to you. There will be an article on Substack by me exploring some of these questions in more detail and offering my reflections of how we as a community go forward. But we'd also love to hear from you on your thoughts on how we better engage around the global health crisis. So with that, have a great week and a safe week, everyone.